On today's episode of Locked On Mets for a Throwback Thursday, we're going to go back in time and look at the 5 biggest draft busts in Mets history.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans who are watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing about the Mets, justbaseball.com. So let's start off this list of the 5 biggest draft busts in Mets history with someone that is close to my heart because I have about 25 autographs signed by him from Port St. Lucie spring training games over the years where my dad would tell me, oh my God, you got to get this guy's autograph because he is the future of the franchise. He's the next 5-tool center fielder. The guy could do it all. A first-round pick back in 2003. That is, of course, Mets legend Lastings Thrillage, or more commonly known as Lastings Milledge. Wow. I mean, we could do multiple shows just talking about the incredible Mets career of a Lastings Milledge. What a moment in time he had early on as the top prospect in the farm system. Then he was a small part of the 2006 Mets that won the division, got to enjoy a little champagne shower that year, but his career kind of peaked a little bit early. Never really did have a good run in the majors. You look at his class, I mean, it's not like the 2003 draft class was really loaded. You have Nick Markakis, is the player with the best career WAR out of that class. He was the 7th overall pick that year. Adam Jones, the second best player from that class. He was drafted 37th, 25 picks after the Mets took Milledge at 12. I think if you just look at those two players, right, the idea of a 5-tool center fielder, the Mets missed. If they could have drafted Adam Jones, who knows how much different Mets history is. I mean, that's a player that really could have changed a lot of things. Had an unbelievable career with the Orioles. It would have been interesting to see how that could have played out for the Mets. Would have been right square in the middle of his prime when it came to the 2015 team, and those teams during that span obviously could have made it up a little bit quicker than that. But overall, you look at Milledge in comparison, not an all-star, not a consistent starter, a guy that kind of flamed out of the league pretty quickly. With the Mets, he hit 257, a 326 on base, a 414 slugging percentage in 115 games. Not terrible. I mean, there's other busts that we can talk about that have been worse. An honorable mention, of course, would be Fernando Martinez. He does not qualify for this list because he's not technically a draft bust. He was an international free agent, but Martinez came right after Milledge. And in comparison to that line I just mentioned, I mean, with the Mets, Martinez hit 183 with a 250 on base and a 290 slugging across 3 seasons. Only played 47 games for the Mets. He just was not good enough to get any more playing time. He got traded, ended up, pretty much washing out of the league pretty quickly. Martinez was a consensus top 100 prospect like Milledge every year from 2007 through 2010. Made his debut in 2009 at 20 years old. Never panned out for Milledge. Never panned out, but he did have a decent season with the Nationals the year after the Mets traded him heading into the 2008 campaign. They traded him for Ryan Church and Brian Schneider, and Milledge went back to the Nationals. Church and Schneider were starters for that 2008 Mets team that won 89 games. Milledge was a high upside play for the Nationals, and he did fairly well playing every day out there in center field. He had 14 home runs, had 40 extra base hits in 138 games, but that was really the only strong-ish season of his career. Bounced around a little bit, went to Pittsburgh, then over to Chicago with the White Sox, ultimately landed in Japan where he had some really nice years and made a decent career for himself overseas. So Millage was always someone that fans, put a lot of pressure on. There was a lot of hope attached to him. Never quite panned out. And similarly, years prior, a guy who is very prominent now for Moneyball, Billy Beane, was a draft bust for the Mets. They got him the same year they drafted Darryl Strawberry. Beane was the second of 3 first-round picks the Mets made that year, with Strawberry being obviously that first pick. Beane only had 18 at bats in his Mets career, 3 hits. Struggled really mightily in those latter years with the Mets in the minors. Gets traded, changes scenery, might spark his career. It didn't. His biggest claim to fame with the New York Mets was being one of the players that went out to acquire Tim Tuffel prior to the 1986 season. And in that, he becomes a little bit less of a bust because he served a purpose in Mets franchise history, Tuffel being a key member of that 1986 Mets team that you might not have gotten if you didn't have a Billy Beane. But obviously, as a prospect, a huge bust. And there's still 3 more that are, in my opinion, still way worse than Millage and Beane. We're going to talk about them in just a minute. This is the time of year where I'll generally just give up on my New Year's resolutions, but that's not going to happen for me this year because thanks to Built Bar, I can stick to my resolution to be healthier this year because I actually enjoy eating them. So it's really not hard. I don't know if you've heard of the Built Bar Puffs, but you're missing out if you haven't tried them yet. These are protein infused marshmallows. I mean, they're fluffy, they're marshmallowy. They're not just a protein bar, they're a treat, and they're covered in 100% real chocolate. They have great flavors like the cinnamony churro, coconut marshmallow, banana cream pie, all of them so good. Not to mention, if you just want to try the traditional Built Bar, there's countless flavors like mint brownie, coconut almond, and the brand new and delicious white chocolate cookies and cream. It is to die for. If you want to try Built Bar today, go to built.com, use the promo code LOCK15. You're going to get 15% off your next order. Again, that's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com. All right, so let's talk about Elvis Presley. That confuse you a little bit? We're talking draft bust. How did Elvis Presley get in the conversation? Well, because his third cousin was drafted by the Mets. Good old Kirk Presley. He was the 8th overall pick in 1993. Never made it past A-ball. So that'll tell you what kind of bust Kirk Presley was for the New York Mets. But even him as a pitcher does not get anywhere close to one of the biggest busts in Mets history. Some would argue it's the biggest bust. Maybe it is. My number one is more about who the Mets could have drafted as opposed to the guy they did draft, and we'll get to him in a bit. But this other bust, which is right up there, is Paul Wilson. A number 1 overall pick. Number 1 overall. You can't miss on a number 1 overall pick. Paul Wilson was coming out of FSU, and he was supposed to be part of what Mets fans and pundits alike were dubbing Generation K. Ooh, that sounded good. Generation K. Jason Isringhausen, Bill Puscipher. I don't even know if I pronounced that right because why would I know Puscipher's name? He never amounted to anything. Actually, could have qualified for this list as well as Isringhausen. Technically could have, but Isringhausen was a 44th round pick. So, that was surplus value to get him to elite top prospect status. And of course, Isringhausen went on to be a great closer with the Cardinals for many years. He even came back to the Mets and pitched out of their bullpen in the latter years of his career. But you look at old Billy P and Paul Wilson, and whew, a couple of huge misses. And for Wilson, again, the first overall pick in his class, and just because of injuries and everything else, never quite was effective for the Mets. Had one season where he pitched for them, where he made 26 starts at a 5.38 ERA. That was the only year where he gave any significant contributions to the Mets, and they were negative contributions with that inflated ERA. The injuries, are always what can ruin any good pitching prospect, and that was certainly the case with Paul Wilson. But it's rough when you strike out on the number one overall pick. It happens more in baseball than other sports. You don't see a ton of first overall picks in the NBA not panning out. I mean, there is, of course, your Anthony Bennett's of the world. There has been number one overall picks that haven't worked out, but in the NBA and the NFL, generally, teams don't miss on the number one overall pick. And you would hope the same could be said about baseball. And at times, if you're drafting a Bryce Harper, that can be an easy slam dunk conversation. But other times, those picks are not a given. And Paul Wilson was one example of the Mets flopping on a number one overall pick. But it happened to them twice. And the first time was a lot earlier in their franchise, where the Mets could have had a Hall of Famer, but instead drafted a catcher that would never even make an MLB debut. I will discuss that more in just a minute. There might be less football being played, but betonline.net has way more stuff to bet on this playoff season. From scores, totals, player performance props to where the next fire coach is going to land, BetOnline is the number one spot for all things NFL betting in 2022. And it's not just football. BetOnline.net's basketball, hockey, boxing, and UFC odds coverage is the best in the business. From sports right down to your favorite Vegas casino games, BetOnline is your number one online wagering destination. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to wager on all your favorite sports and play your favorite games. Bet online, where the game starts. All right, so we have officially arrived to the point where I get to name the biggest draft bust in New York Mets history. A catcher by the name of Steve Chilcott, who was drafted first overall in 1966. Now, Chilcott never played a day in the major leagues. It's obviously a bust. There's a reason why this bust hurts a little bit more, because there was another player that could have been had first overall in 1966 that went on to have an illustrious career. This guy, I don't know if you've heard of him. Not too prominent. Reggie Jackson. I think he had some nickname Mr. October for his clutch hitting in the biggest moments. A guy who ended up going into the Hall of Fame as a Yankee. And the Mets could have had Reggie Jackson, but they went with Steve Chilcott instead, and that is just devastating. I just want to, even though we all know Reggie Jackson is awesome, I want to pull up his career numbers really quick. Let's actually just look at the early years of his career. Okay, first year, not great, 35 games, hit below the Mendoza line. Second year, 1968, 22 years old, a couple years after the Mets could have drafted him first overall. The guy hits 29 home runs. The following year, he hit 47 home runs. This was a span that lasted 14 seasons where he hit at least 20 home runs, finished his career with 563 home runs. Is the all-time career leader in strikeouts, not a thing that you want, but when you're hitting again, 563 bombs, 1,702 RBIs, five-time World Series champion, two-time Silver Slugger, 14-time All-Star, two-time World Series MVP, and of course, Hall of Famer. Yeah, I'd rather have Reggie Jackson. I'm sure Chilcott was just fantastic in the minor leagues when he, didn't do enough to even earn a promotion to the big leagues. I'm sure it was worth it, but yeah, that's one you wish you had back. And really, you go through Mets history, and obviously, there's other prospects that have been bust that we could talk about when it comes to guys who were signed, other guys that were drafted. But what I will say is the Mets have turned a new leaf over the past decade plus, where their scouting has been really, really good. And I don't think we commend them enough for it. But you look at the first round picks the Mets have made since 2010, and really only one bust, maybe two, if you count Kumar Rocker as a bust, this most recent pick, just because they didn't sign him. But that's not even necessarily the case, because they now have a comp pick. So depending on who the comp pick is, that becomes, the new future of that selection. I don't think that you really look at Rocker and say, oh, it's a bust because he didn't sign. It's, you could sign a great pitcher in this year's draft who can be amazing for the Mets. So I don't really count that. And again, if you go back to 2010, It's Matt Harvey, a guy that obviously didn't have the best career, but had incredible moments early on and was a huge superstar that helped lead the Mets to the World Series. Look at that. Wearing the 2015 League Champions shirt. Found this old thing in the back of my closet. Figured I'd throw it on today for a little Throwback Thursday segment. But yeah, Harvey was great. Brandon Nemo, next first round pick, obviously has had a really good career up to this point, a huge part of the current Mets. Michael Fulmer was a rookie of the year. I know his career has gotten sidetracked, but still obviously a good pick by the Mets. You have Gavin Cecchini, who is the bust, but after that, it's Kevin Plewecki. I know he hasn't been an elite starting catcher, but a good major league catcher is a good major league catcher. That's not a bust of a pick. Plewecki is going to have a very long career because of what he can do behind the dish. That is not nothing. You have Dominick Smith. Again, maybe not incredible for first round talent when he's ultimately put together, but a major leaguer nonetheless who's had some moments. You have Michael Conforto. Obviously, we know Conforto's had a very good career. Justin Dunn starting to figure it out in Seattle. Anthony Kay has really struggled with the Blue Jays. That could be a bust ultimately. But the Mets used him as a trade chip and got Marcus Stroman out of it. So in that sense, not necessarily a bust for the Mets purposes. David Peterson, jury's still out on him. Jared Kelenic didn't have the best year, but I think we all expect Kelenic to have a much better success in the future. You got Brett Beatty, we spent so much time this offseason talking about, thrilled about his potential. He could be a really great starting third baseman for the Mets in the not too distant future. So that's exciting. You got Pete Crow Armstrong. Again, jury's still out, but did net you a really good player in Javi Baez for a stretch run that ultimately proved to be futile, but that's not Baez's fault. And then lastly, again, Kumar Rocker. The Mets have 6 picks in the top 100 this upcoming draft. It's going to be critical to hit on those picks. And honestly, with the way the scouting department has been over the past decade, I'm pretty confident the Mets are going to get a couple really promising talents with those selections, particularly the early selections with the comp pick they're getting for Rocker, with their own pick, with the comp picks they're going to get from Michael Conforto, as well as the one they already got from the Angels in Noah Syndergaard. All of that will be great for the Mets as they try to revamp this farm system. But as we look into the past, the biggest bust in Mets history is going to have to be Steve Chilcott, because you could have had Reggie Jackson, Paul Wilson, a close second, both of them number 1 overall picks that did not pan out for the Mets. Kirk Presley, Billy Beane, and Last Village, the other 3 that fell out this top 5. If you got any other suggestions, put them in the comments if you're watching on YouTube, or reach out to me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan and let me know what you think. As always, though, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. As I just mentioned, you can follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. You can follow the show at Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Now for your second listen, check out Locked On Bets, hosted by your boy Q and handicapping expert Lee Sterling. Locked On Bets is where you want to go for all your daily gambling needs. You can follow Locked On Bets wherever you get podcasts.